In the summer of 1518, something extraordinary and terrifying happened in the city of Strasbourg. A woman stepped into the narrow street and began to dance. Nothing unusual about that, you might think. Except she didn't stop. Not for hours. Not for days. And soon, dozens more joined her, trapped in a relentless, exhausting dance that some wouldn't survive. This isn't fiction. This isn't folklore. This is one of history's most bizarre and well-documented medical mysteries. Welcome to the story of the dancing plague of 1518, an event so strange that even today, scientists struggle to explain what really happened. To understand this bizarre event, we first need to understand the world it happened in. Strasbourg in 1518 was a bustling city in the Holy Roman Empire, located in the Alsace region, which is now part of modern-day France. But this wasn't the prosperous, peaceful city you might imagine. The early 16th century was a brutal time to be alive. Europe was still recovering from the Black Death, which had killed millions just over a century before. Famine was common. Disease was everywhere. The average person lived with constant hunger, backbreaking labor, and the ever-present fear of death. Strasbourg itself was experiencing particularly hard times. Recent famines had devastated the population. Smallpox and syphilis ravaged communities. The gap between the wealthy elite and the starving poor had never been wider. People were desperate, hopeless, and looking for answers anywhere they could find them. This was also a deeply superstitious age. People believed in divine punishment, demonic possession, and the power of saints to cure or curse. The church dominated daily life, and most people interpreted misfortune as God's judgment on their sins. Into this powder keg of desperation and superstition, something unprecedented was about to ignite. In July 1518, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into a narrow street in Strasbourg and began to dance. Contemporary chronicles tell us she danced fervently, wildly, for hours without stopping. At first, people watched with curiosity. Perhaps she was celebrating something? Perhaps she'd had too much wine? But as the sun set and Frau Trophia continued dancing through the night, curiosity turned to concern. She danced the next day, and the next. Historical records tell us she danced for between 4 to 6 days straight, only stopping when she collapsed from exhaustion. Her feet were bloody. She was barely conscious. But when she recovered enough strength, she would start dancing again. Now, you might think this was the ravings of a single disturbed individual. But here's where the story takes its truly inexplicable turn. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. By the end of August, the number had swelled to around 400 people, all dancing uncontrollably in the streets of Strasbourg. These weren't joyful celebrations. Contemporary accounts describe people dancing with expressions of anguish and terror, unable to stop even as they begged for help. Their feet bled through their shoes. Some collapsed from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes. The physician notes from the time are chilling. People danced until they literally dropped dead from exhaustion. The city authorities were completely baffled. Nothing like this had ever happened before. They needed to do something. But what? After consulting with physicians, the city leaders made a decision that, in hindsight, seems absolutely insane. They decided the dancers needed to dance it out. The prevailing medical theory of the time suggested that the afflicted had hot blood, and that the only cure was to let them continue dancing until the fever broke. So the authorities built stages. They hired musicians. They even paid professional dancers to help keep the afflicted moving. The city essentially facilitated what was already happening, believing it would help cure the dancers. You can imagine the scene. Hundreds of people dancing day and night in the streets, musicians playing endlessly, while the afflicted writhed and spun with bloody feet and desperate expressions. The city had turned into something resembling a nightmarish festival. But it didn't work. More people kept joining. The death toll climbed. Something else was clearly needed. The religious authorities had their own interpretation. This was divine punishment, they declared. God was angry at the people of Strasbourg for their sins, their vanity, their worldliness. The cure wasn't more dancing. It was prayer and penance. So the approach changed dramatically. The stages were dismantled. The music stopped. The dancers were taken to religious shrines, particularly to a chapel dedicated to Saint Vitus, the patron saint invoked against dancing mania and various afflictions. And here's the remarkable thing. Slowly, gradually, the dancing stopped. By early September, the plague had ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Now, before we dive into theories about what caused this, let's establish something important. This really happened. This isn't urban legend or medieval mythology. We have extensive documentation from the time. Physician notes, city council records, cathedral sermons, and chronicle accounts all describe the event in detail. The Strasbourg City Archives contain records of payments made to musicians and stage builders during the plague. Historical documents even name specific victims. We know that Frau Trophia was one of the first, if not the first. We have records of authorities trying different interventions. We have accounts from multiple independent sources describing the same events. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Throughout the medieval and early modern period, there were numerous outbreaks of dancing mania across Europe, though the 1518 Strasbourg event was by far the largest and best documented. Similar epidemics occurred in 1374 along the Rhine River, in 1463 in Strasbourg itself, and sporadically in other locations throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The phenomenon was real, witnessed by hundreds, and recorded by credible sources. So if it really happened, the question becomes, why? What could possibly cause hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably for weeks? Over the centuries, scholars have proposed numerous theories to explain the dancing plague. Let's examine the main ones. Theory 1. Ergot poisoning. One popular theory suggests the dancers consumed bread made from rye infected with ergot fungus. Ergot contains alkaloids similar to LSD and can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and spasms that might resemble dancing. The problem with this theory: ergot poisoning typically causes the constriction of blood vessels, leading to gangrene in the extremities. Victims would lose sensation and motor control, not gain it. The historical accounts describe people dancing intensely for days. This doesn't match ergot symptoms, which would more likely result in writhing and seizures, not coordinated movement. Additionally, if ergot was the cause, we'd expect to see other symptoms throughout the population who ate the same contaminated grain. Yet the dancing seemed to affect specific individuals while leaving others untouched. Theory 2. Mass psychogenic illness. This is currently the most widely accepted explanation among historians and medical researchers. Mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria, occurs when psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms and spreads through a population through social mechanisms. The conditions in 1518 Strasbourg were perfect for such an outbreak. The population was traumatized by famine, disease, and poverty. They lived in constant stress and fear. In this environment, psychological breaking points were inevitable. In medieval culture, there was a widespread belief in curses, particularly the curse of Saint Vitus, which was thought to force people to dance. If you believed you were cursed, and you saw others dancing uncontrollably, your own anxiety and suggestibility could trigger the same response. This theory explains why the dancing stopped after religious intervention. Once the afflicted were taken to Saint Vitus's shrine and underwent religious rituals, the psychological trigger was resolved. They believed they'd been cured, and so they were. Modern examples of mass psychogenic illness include the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962, where uncontrollable laughter spread through schools in Tanzania, and various cases of mass fainting or twitching in schools and workplaces worldwide. Theory 3. Religious ecstasy or sect activity. Some historians have suggested the dancing was a form of religious ecstasy or the activity of a heretical sect. In medieval Europe, there were groups who practiced extreme forms of worship, including frenzied dancing. However, the contemporary accounts clearly describe the dancers as suffering, not worshiping. They begged for help. They appeared terrified. This doesn't match the behavior of willing participants in a religious ceremony. Theory 4. A choreographed protest. A more recent theory suggests the dancing might have been a form of protest or political statement by the oppressed lower classes against their circumstances. In a world where open rebellion was impossible, perhaps dancing offered a way to disrupt normal life and draw attention to their suffering. This is an intriguing idea, but it doesn't explain why the dancers themselves seemed unable to control their behavior or why many died from exhaustion. If it was a deliberate protest, why would participants dance themselves to death? The most likely explanation, the consensus among modern historians, including John Waller, who wrote the definitive book on the subject, is that the dancing plague was a case of mass psychogenic illness triggered by extreme psychological distress in a particular cultural context. The people of Strasbourg believed in the curse of Saint Vitus. They were living through unbearable conditions. When Frau Troffea began dancing, possibly triggered by her own psychological crisis, others who were similarly stressed and who shared the same cultural beliefs began manifesting the same symptoms. The fact that the city authorities initially encouraged the dancing likely made things worse, legitimizing and amplifying the behavior. Only when the approach changed to religious intervention, addressing the psychological and cultural roots of the phenomenon, did the dancing finally stop. The dancing plague of 1518 might seem like a bizarre footnote in history, but it actually teaches us profound lessons about the human mind, the power of belief, and the impact of social and environmental stress on communities. First, it reminds us that the boundary between the psychological and physical is far more porous than we often assume. Extreme stress can manifest in very real, very physical ways. The dancers weren't faking. They were experiencing genuine, uncontrollable physical symptoms generated by psychological distress. Second, it shows us the incredible power of shared belief systems. In a culture where everyone believed in the curse of Saint Vitus, that curse could become functionally real, triggering genuine physical responses. Third, it illustrates how crises can spread through communities through social mechanisms. Anxiety, fear, and physical symptoms can be contagious, especially in stressed populations. We saw echoes of this during the COVID-19 pandemic, where anxiety spread as readily as the virus itself. The dancing plague also offers a cautionary tale about how authorities respond to mass phenomena they don't understand. The initial decision to build stages and hire musicians almost certainly made things worse. Sometimes well-intentioned interventions can amplify the very problems they're trying to solve. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the dancing plague reminds us that even the strangest historical events were real experiences for real people. Frau Troffea and the hundreds who danced with her weren't characters in a story. They were human beings suffering in ways we can barely imagine, trapped in a nightmare of their own making, unable to stop until their community found a way to help them. Today, when we face mass phenomena, whether they're social media-driven panics, mysterious illnesses, or collective anxieties, we would do well to remember Strasbourg in 1518. Understanding requires empathy, cultural context, and a recognition that the human mind, especially under stress, is capable of extraordinary and inexplicable things. The dancing plague of 1518 remains one of history's most fascinating mysteries. Even with centuries of hindsight and modern psychological understanding, we can't be entirely certain what happened in those streets of Strasbourg during that strange summer. What we do know is that hundreds of people danced, suffered, and some died in an event that defies easy explanation. We know that human psychology, culture, and stress can combine in ways that produce phenomena that seem impossible until they happen. And we know that history is far stranger than we often imagine, full of events that challenge our understanding of what humans are capable of, both in terms of suffering and in terms of the mysterious workings of the collective human mind. The next time you hear about something that seems too bizarre to be true, remember the dancing plague. Sometimes reality is stranger than any fiction we could create. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's strangest events, please like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What other bizarre historical mysteries would you like me to cover? Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history is always more complicated than it first appears.